this video, we're going to take a look at some of the subtle differences when attempting to configure JPA for an application, also known as the Java Persistence API. As its name applies, JPA is really just an interface which establishes the contract for a persistence provider such as Hibernate. JPA alone wouldn't actually accomplish anything, as there is no underlying implementation to persist and retrieve objects from the database. Now, Hibernate can be used without JPA, which will ultimately be the case when using Hibernate core with XML mappings, but there are some advantages to using Hibernate's JPA implementation. The main advantage is ultimately the ability to change persistence providers, such as switching to Eclipse Link or OpenJPA, without actually having to change any code, with the exception, of course, of modifying the persistence provider inside the configuration. This isn't something you would do very often, if at all, but it's better to program to an interface for this reason. Another advantage to using JPA is that entities are automatically scanned, so we don't necessarily have to update our configuration when adding new classes, which are annotated with the add entity annotation. So let's take a look at how we configure JPA for an application. So I have an existing Hibernate application here, and of particular interest here is this meta-inf directory inside my source directory here. The specification for JPA essentially dictates that the configuration has to essentially reside inside this meta-inf directory inside your class path. So that's what we have here. We have a persistence.xml file, and if you take a look at the structure of this here, let's take a look. So we have a persistence unit tag here with the name myPersistence_unit, and this is mandatory. So we're going to essentially reference this when we ultimately create our factory, and then we have the transaction type here. So the two options for transaction type are ultimately resource local, which gives us control over the entity manager, or we could ultimately change this to JTA, which in that case the entity manager would be actually managed by the container itself. So we're actually going to just keep this at resource local. The second component, or tag nested inside of this persistence unit tag here, is the provider. So this is necessary in order to tell the application which persistence provider we're using. So of course we are actually using Hibernate JPA, so we're going to be referring to the provider org.hibernatejpa.hibernate persistence provider. Now, you'll notice, of course, here that there are additional properties here, and this is ultimately very similar to the Hibernate configuration. So I've actually kept both files intact here so I could sort of contrast them. So again, we have the persistence.xml file, but we also have the Hibernate cfg.xml file, which we'd be using if we weren't actually using a JPA configuration here. So that's what we have here. And of course, you can see that there are some similarities to the persistence.xml file. So you have all of the properties necessary in order to establish a connection to your database. So you have the property name, so javax.persistence.jdbc.driver, and of course you have the Oracle driver here, which is necessary to connect to an Oracle database. We have the Oracle connection string here. We then have the username, password, and then we can actually implement some of our Hibernate specific properties here. So you can see here that I've show_SQL, format SQL, and then of course we will require the dialect so that we know, or so that the application knows what type of database we are essentially dealing with. And then we have the property HBM 2DDL auto set to create, so that when the application is essentially initialized, our schema is ultimately created. So that's how you configure a JPA application. Now, if we take a look at this utility class here that I created to ultimately initialize the application. So what happens here is we have a JPA util, so we have a private static final entity manager here. So this is the entity manager that I was talking about. And in here, as I mentioned, we are essentially calling persistence.createEntityManagerFactory, and we're referring to the myPersistence_unit that we had declared in the persistence.xml file. So here we have the persistence-unit name myPersistence_unit, so that's what we're referring to in our JPA util class here. And then of course we are returning an entity manager. So if we take a look at our main class, we are ultimately calling our JPA util getAnyManager, and if I start this application, you'll notice that this entity that I have in my entity package here actually gets created. So the table is actually created based on the class definition. So you can see here that I have a create statement inside of my console here, and that's ultimately how you configure a JPA application.